Welcome back, dear reader. Tonight we step away from the noise of the modern world and into something older, something quieter, something that smells of cold stone, damp English countryside, and a secret buried just beneath the surface of a very proper, very respectable family. The story you're about to read is called The Cursed Emerald of Sussex, a legendary green jewel, a dead man on a library floor, and a note, handwritten, unsigned, warning that the ancient curse had finally come to collect what was owed. Scotland Yard was baffled, the family was grieving, and the emerald vanished, as if the darkness itself had reached through the walls and taken it. But one man did not believe in curses. One man believed only in order, in method, in what he called, with great affection for himself, the little grey cells. Hercule Poirot was coming to Sussex, and nothing, not superstition, not old family secrets, not even a very convincing ghost story, would stop him from finding the truth. The dead man and the curse note. The telegram arrived on a Thursday morning. Hercule Poirot was in the middle of a most satisfying breakfast. 2 perfectly symmetrical pieces of toast, a soft-boiled egg timed to exactly 4 minutes, and his tisane steaming gently in its little china cup, when George, his manservant, appeared at the door of the dining room with the silver tray and that particular expression on his face that meant the outside world was about to intrude. Poirot did not look up immediately. He was attending to his egg. "One moment, George," he said, with the quiet authority of a man who believed that breakfast, like murder investigations, deserved one's complete and undivided attention. He finished. He dabbed his moustaches with a linen napkin, carefully, symmetrically, and only then extended his hand. And the telegram was brief, as all urgent things tend to be. Sir Edmund Ashworth found dead. Stop emerald missing. Stop curse note left at scene. Stop Inspector Japp requests your presence. Stop Ashworth Hall. Sussex stop come at once. Stop. Poirot read it twice. Then he set it down beside his tisane and was quiet for a moment. The particular quietness of a man whose mind had already begun to move, though his body remained perfectly still. "Georges," he said at last, "please prepare my bag. The brown one, not the black. And ensure my second suit is pressed. Sussex in October is not, I think, a place that forgives poor preparation." Ashworth Hall sat at the end of a long gravel drive, flanked on both sides by elm trees that had gone half bare with the season. It was a large house, Georgian in bones, Victorian in temperament, with tall, narrow windows that caught the grey October light and gave nothing back. The kind of house, Poirot reflected, as the motor car rolled slowly through the gates, that had opinions about its occupants. He had seen many such houses in his years in England. They all carried the same particular weight of old money, older pride, and secrets folded carefully into the walls, like letters one never quite managed to throw away. Inspector Japp was waiting at the front steps, his hat pulled low against a wind that had come in sharp and cold off the downs. He looked, as he often did when a case had gotten under his skin, like a man who had not slept particularly well and was not entirely pleased about it. "Poirot," he extended his hand. "Glad you came. Though I'll tell you now, this one's a strange business." "All murders are strange, mon ami," Poirot said pleasantly, stepping out of the motor car and adjusting his coat with 2 precise tugs. "That is rather what makes them murders and not simply deaths." Japp gave him the look, the one that meant he found Poirot either very useful or very irritating, and had not yet decided which. After all these years, it was something of a comfortable look between them. "Come inside then," Japp said. "I'll show you." The library of Ashworth Hall was a long panelled room on the ground floor, facing the east garden. It smelled of old leather and wood smoke, and underneath both, something sharper, something Poirot identified quietly to himself as the particular staleness of a room that had been sealed since the previous night. Sir Edmund Ashworth had been found at 7:30 in the morning by his housekeeper, a Mrs. Dora Peel, who had come to draw the curtains and discovered her employer lying face down on the hearthrug, quite dead, with one arm stretched toward the cold fireplace as though reaching for warmth that had already gone. The body had since been moved. The local police surgeon had been and gone, but the chalk outline remained, and Poirot stood at its edge for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back, looking not at the outline but at the floor around it. "Cause of death?" he asked without turning. "Digitalis poisoning," Japp said from behind him. "Surgeon's fairly certain, pending the full post-mortem. Concentrated dose by the look of it. Fast acting. And the time of death? Somewhere between 10 o'clock and midnight. He was last seen alive at 9:30. His nephew, Mr. Roland Ashworth, spoke to him briefly in the hallway. After that, nothing. House went to bed. By morning, there he was." Poirot nodded slowly, still looking at the floor. There was a desk near the window, a large serious desk of dark mahogany, the sort that suggested its owner had believed in the gravity of correspondence. On it, everything was as one might expect. A blotter, an inkstand, a small lamp. Everything, that is, except for the glass. A single whiskey glass sat at the right edge of the blotter. It had been used. It had not been cleared away. "The glass has been tested?" Poirot asked. "Sent to the lab this morning? We expect it was in the whiskey, yes." Poirot moved toward the desk, but he did not touch the glass. He simply bent slightly at the waist. Looking at it from several angles, the way one might study a painting, one is not yet sure one understands. Then he straightened and turned his attention to the wall behind the desk. There, between two dark oil portraits of Ashworth ancestors, both of whom looked as though they had found life broadly disappointing, was an empty space on the wall. A rectangular patch, slightly less faded than the wallpaper around it, where something had hung for many years and no longer hung. A display case, now gone. "The Emerald of Sussex," Japp said, following his gaze. "That's where it was kept. Mounted case, velvet backing, the whole business. Glass was broken, from the inside near as we can tell, which means the case was opened, and then the glass was smashed afterward. Presumably to make it look more dramatic. And the note." Japp produced a small evidence envelope and withdrew from it, carefully, a single piece of paper. It was not, Poirot observed immediately, a cheap piece of paper. It was heavy, cream-coloured, the kind sold at proper stationers. The handwriting upon it was deliberate, not hasty, not disguised with any great cleverness, but written slowly and with visible intention. He read it. "The Ashworth blood has carried the stone long enough. The curse of the Maharaja does not forget and does not forgive. What was taken in greed shall be returned in death. The emerald goes back to the darkness. Do not look for it. Do not look for us." Poirot read it twice, as was his habit, and then handed it back to Japp without expression. "Well," Japp said, "what do you make of it?" Poirot was quiet for a moment. He walked to the window and looked out at the east garden. The bare rose bushes, the gravel path, the low grey sky pressing down over the downs. "I make of it," he said at last, "that someone in this house is not nearly as clever as they believe themselves to be." He turned. "The paper, Japp, did you observe? Heavy stock, cream, the kind one finds in a writing desk, not purchased specially for the occasion. And the hand, it is controlled. Careful. This was not written in excitement or in haste. It was written beforehand. Composed, one might say, like a small and rather unpleasant piece of theatre." Japp frowned. "You think it's staged?" "I think," Poirot said, with the particular gentleness he reserved for stating things he considered obvious. "No, that curses do not require stationery, mon ami. And I think that whoever killed Sir Edmund Ashworth wished very much for us to be looking outward, toward ancient history, toward mysticism, toward the romantic notion of a Maharaja's vengeance, rather than inward." He glanced back at the empty space on the wall. Toward this house, toward this family. He picked up his hat from the chair where he had set it and smoothed the brim once with his thumb. "I should like," he said, "to meet the family now. The grey cells Awaken." The drawing room of Ashworth Hall was the kind of room that had been arranged at some point in the distant past for the purpose of receiving guests, and had not, in Poirot's estimation, recovered from the effort. There were too many chairs, too carefully placed, Too many small tables bearing too many small ornaments. It was a room designed to suggest ease, while permitting none. The family had assembled there at Jap's request, and they sat now in that particular arrangement that bereaved families always seem to fall into. Not quite together, not quite apart, each person an island, with just enough distance from the others to maintain the appearance of composure. Poirot stood near the door for a moment before entering properly. It was a habit of his, this brief pause on the threshold, that he had never entirely explained to anyone, including himself. He told himself it was to observe, and it was partly, but it was also, though he would not have admitted it, a moment to gather himself. He was 63 years old, and the motor car from London had been draughty, and his left knee had been making its feelings known since Crawley. He stepped inside. There were 4 of them. The first was Mr. Roland Ashworth, the nephew, the one who had last spoken to Sir Edmund the previous evening. He was perhaps 35, lean and angular, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had since developed opinions. He sat closest to the window, one leg crossed over the other, and he was watching Poirot with the careful, measuring look of a man who had decided in advance that he would not be impressed. Beside him, though not close enough to suggest warmth, sat a woman Poirot took immediately to be Roland's wife. She was introduced, a moment later, as Mrs. Cecily Ashworth. She was younger than her husband by perhaps 8 years, fair-haired, with a quality of stillness about her that Poirot found immediately interesting. Not the stillness of grief, something more deliberate than that. In the armchair nearest the fireplace sat Miss Lavinia Ashworth, Sir Edmund's sister, unmarried, somewhere in her late 50s. She was a small woman, sharp-featured, with bright dark eyes that moved quickly around the room, and a black shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, despite the fact that the fire was, in Poirot's opinion, already rather too warm. She had a handkerchief in her hand. She had not, he noticed, used it. And finally, standing slightly apart from the others near the bookcase, as though he had not quite committed to being in the room at all, was a young man of perhaps 22 or 23. He was introduced as Mr. Philip Ashworth, Roland's younger brother. He was dark-haired, pale, and had the look of someone who had been crying earlier and was now working very hard to ensure no one knew it. Poirot took all of this in during the space of perhaps 15 seconds. Then he smiled, the small, courteous smile that gave nothing away, and settled himself into the one remaining chair that no one had taken. "I am most grateful to you all," he began, in the mild, unhurried tone he used when he wished people to underestimate him, "for seeing me at such a difficult time. I shall try not to detain you longer than is necessary. I have only a few small questions." Roland Ashworth uncrossed his legs. "I'm not sure what you expect to find that Scotland Yard hasn't already covered, Monsieur Poirot. Inspector Japp has had the whole house turned over this morning." "Indeed," Poirot agreed pleasantly. "And I am sure Inspector Japp has been most thorough. But you know how it is, a fresh pair of eyes, a different angle. Sometimes one notices the small thing that the thorough man, in his thoroughness, steps over." Roland said nothing, but the measuring look remained. Poirot began with the simplest question, where each of them had been the previous evening, after 9:30, when Sir Edmund had last been seen. Roland had gone directly to his room, he said. He had been reading. His wife could confirm it, and Cecily Ashworth confirmed it, with a small nod and no elaboration whatsoever. Miss Lavinia had retired even earlier. Before 9, she said. She suffered from headaches, and the damp weather had been particularly unkind. She'd taken a powder and gone straight to bed. Philip had been in the billiard room until perhaps 10:30, and had then gone upstairs. He had not, he said, seen his uncle at all after supper. Poirot listened to all of this with his head tilted very slightly to one side, a posture that looked like polite attention and was, in fact, something considerably more active. He was not listening only to the words, he was listening to the pace of them, the rhythm, the places where a sentence ended just slightly too neatly. He asked about the emerald next, the emerald of Sussex, its proper provenance. As Poirot understood it from Japp's briefing on the drive down, was this: Sir Edmund's grandfather, one Colonel Ashworth, had acquired the stone in India in 1887 under circumstances that the family had always described as a purchase, and that certain other parties over the years had described rather differently. It was a large stone, nearly 40 carats, set in an old gold mount, and it had been in the family ever since, displayed in the library as a point of considerable pride. "The curse," Poirot said, quite conversationally. "The note speaks of a Maharaja." Was this a story known within the family? A brief silence. It was Miss Lavinia who answered, pulling her shawl a fraction tighter. "There was always talk," she said. "When we were children, Edmund used to tell us about it. He said the stone had been cursed by its original owner, that any Ashworth who possessed it would come to a bad end." She paused. "He thought it was romantic. He rather enjoyed the story." "And did you enjoy it, Miss Ashworth?" Her bright dark eyes met his steadily. "I thought it was nonsense," she said. "I still think it is nonsense. Edmund is dead, Monsieur Poirot. I would prefer to speak of things that are real." Poirot inclined his head respectfully. He rather liked Miss Lavinia. "The note," he said, turning now to Roland. "The one left in the library. Had you seen it before Inspector Japp showed it to the household this morning?" "Of course not," Roland said quickly, perhaps a fraction too quickly. "And you, Mrs. Ashworth?" Cecily shook her head. Her hands, folded in her lap, did not move. "Mr. Philip?" The young man looked up. But he had been staring at the carpet. "No," he said, and then, as though he felt the single word was insufficient. "No, I hadn't seen it. I don't know anything about a note." He said it the way people sometimes do when they're telling the truth about one thing in order to avoid being asked about another. Poirot filed this away. After the family, Poirot asked to speak with the housekeeper. Mrs. Dora Peel was a woman of perhaps 60, solid and grey-haired, with a composed, slightly flattened expression of someone who has spent decades managing other people's crises and has developed, as a result, a certain professional distance from human drama. She had found the body. She had telephoned the police. She had then, by her own account, made tea for the household and ensured that breakfast was served at the usual time. Because in her view, chaos was no excuse for disorder. Poirot approved of this enormously. He asked her about the previous evening. She had been in the kitchen until 10, she said, and then in her sitting room off the back corridor. She had heard nothing unusual. The house had been quiet. "The whiskey decanter in the library," Poirot said. "Was it Sir Edmund's habit to pour for himself in the evenings?" "Yes," Mrs. Peel said. "Every night, regular as anything. 1 glass before bed, sometimes 2 if he'd had a difficult day." "And who had access to the library during the day?" She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "All the family, and myself, for dusting. And Thomas, that's the footman, he laid the fire in there yesterday afternoon, around 4 o'clock. Did anyone visit the library yesterday evening, to your knowledge? After supper, say?" Mrs. Peel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the careful precision of someone choosing their words, "I couldn't say for certain, Monsieur Poirot. The library door was closed when I passed it at 9:30. Whether anyone was inside, I don't know. But," she looked at him steadily, "but the library door, when it's properly closed, makes a sound when it opens. A particular click. I've been in this house 22 years and I know its sounds." She paused. "I heard that click at approximately 10:15, from my sitting room. And you did not investigate?" "It wasn't my place to investigate. Sir Edmund often worked late." "But Sir Edmund," Poirot said gently, "was already dead by 10:15, Mrs. Peel, or very near to it." A silence settled between them. Mrs. Peel's composed expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted very slightly, the way a stone shifts at the bottom of clear water when something passes overhead. "Yes," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about that." Poirot found Japp in the hallway afterward, going through his notes with the focused dissatisfaction of a man who has a great many facts and is not yet sure what they add up to. "Well," Japp said. Poirot did not answer immediately. He was looking at the staircase, the wide carpeted staircase that rose from the centre of the entrance hall and divided at the landing into 2 corridors, one east, one west. The library was at the end of the east corridor, ground floor. The family bedrooms were all on the first floor. The library door was opened at 10:15, Poirot said. After the household had retired, someone came back downstairs. To do what? The deed was already done by then. Precisely, Poirot turned. That is what interests me, mon ami. The poison was in the whiskey. Sir Edmund would have taken it himself, poured himself his nightly glass, and that would have been sufficient. There was no need to return to the library afterward. He paused. Unless something needed to be done, or checked, or taken. Japp's eyes narrowed. The emerald, Poirot agreed quietly. The poison was the murder. The emerald was something else. And the note was left, I think, at the same time. All arranged in one visit, late in the evening, when the house was dark and quiet, and everyone was, supposedly, asleep. He picked up his hat from the hall table. I should like to see the bedrooms, he said. Particularly the one belonging to Mr. Roland Ashworth. Japp looked at him for a moment. You've already made up your mind about something. Not at all, Poirot said with perfect honesty. I have made up my mind about nothing. I have simply noticed that Mr. Roland Ashworth has very clean hands for a man who's been in the country since Monday, and that his wife has said almost nothing at all since we arrived, but has watched every door in this room as though she is keeping count of who goes through them. He moved toward the stairs. Come, Japp, the grey cells are awake. Let us give them something to work on. Shadows in the house. The bedroom allocated to Roland and Cecily Ashworth was on the first floor, east wing, the third door along the corridor, directly above the library. Poirot stood in the doorway for a moment before going in. It was a large room adequately furnished in the heavy, dependable style of a country house that had stopped making decisions about its interiors sometime around 1923 and seen no compelling reason to resume. A double bed, a wardrobe, a writing table beneath the window, 2 armchairs by the fireplace. It was a tidy room, almost aggressively so. Most guests arriving at a country house for a weekend visit achieve a certain comfortable disorder within the first 24 hours. A jacket over a chair back, a book left open on the bedside table, shoes not quite returned to their proper place. It's the natural consequence of living, however temporarily, in a space that is not one's own. Roland Ashworth's room had none of this. Everything was in its place. The wardrobe doors were closed. The surface of the writing table was bare. Even the 2 armchairs were positioned with a symmetry that Poirot, who appreciated symmetry enormously, nonetheless found slightly unnatural in the circumstances. Someone had tidied. Recently, and with purpose. Japp stood beside him, looking around with his hands in his coat pockets. Neat sort of fellow, he said, without conviction. Neat, Poirot agreed. Or careful. He moved to the writing table and bent to examine its surface without touching it. There is a faint ring mark here, Japp, you see? Something cylindrical was placed on this table, a glass or a small bottle, and was removed. The wood is very slightly discoloured, Japp leaned in. Could be anything. It could be, Poirot said, and yet. He straightened and went to the wardrobe. He did not open it. He stood before it for a moment, looking at the keyhole, which was of the old-fashioned variety, the kind that took a large brass key. Then he looked at the small dish on the dressing table, where Roland Ashworth kept his things. Cufflinks, a collar stud, a pocket watch, no key. The wardrobe is locked, Poirot said, and the key is not in the room. Japp tried the door. It held. He looked at Poirot. I'll get it opened, he said. Please, Poirot said, but do not force it. I should prefer Mr. Ashworth not to know, just yet, that we have looked. They found Roland Ashworth in the east garden, alone. He was walking the gravel path between the bare rose beds with his hands clasped behind his back, a posture that might have suggested calm, except that his pace was slightly too fast for a man who was merely taking air. Poirot intercepted him with the pleasant unhurriedness of a man who has all the time in the world. Ah, Mr. Ashworth, you will forgive me. I have just 1 or 2 small things I wish to clarify. Roland stopped. The measuring look returned. I thought we'd covered everything this morning." "Nearly everything," Poirot said agreeably. "You mentioned that after speaking with your uncle, at 9:30, you went directly to your room and spent the remainder of the evening reading. That's correct. And you did not come downstairs again at any point during the night." A brief pause. "Not long, perhaps 2 seconds," but Poirot, who had been counting silences for 40 years, noted it precisely. "No," Roland said. "I did not." "I see." Poirot nodded, as though this were entirely satisfactory. "And your conversation with Sir Edmund in the hallway, it was, you said, brief. What was the nature of it?" Roland's jaw tightened very slightly. "He asked about my journey down from London. I told him the roads had been poor. That was more or less the extent of it. He seemed well, in good spirits. He seemed tired. He said he was going to have his nightcap and turn in early." "His nightcap," Poirot repeated gently. "Yes, the whiskey. Did you see him pour it?" "No, he mentioned it, that's all." "Of course," Poirot smiled. "One final thing, Mr. Ashworth, the emerald. Your uncle's will? Has it been read? Do you know how he intended the estate to be disposed of?" Something moved across Roland Ashworth's face. Too fast to name precisely, but Poirot had seen its cousins many times before. It lived somewhere in the neighbourhood of anger and calculation. "The solicitor comes on Monday," Roland said. "I don't see what that has to do with anything." "Probably nothing," Poirot said warmly. "Forgive an old man his digressions. Thank you, Mr. Ashworth." He watched Roland walk back toward the house, still too fast, still too rigid about the shoulders, and then stood for a moment in the cold garden air, looking up at the east wing of the house, the library window, the bedroom window directly above it. He measured the distance with his eyes, close, very close. He found Philip Ashworth in the billiard room, not playing billiards, but the young man was sitting on the long leather bench along the wall, turning a billiard ball over and over in his hands without appearing to notice he was doing it. He looked up when Poirot entered, and there was something in his face that was not quite guilt and not quite grief, but had elements of both. "May I sit?" Poirot asked. Philip nodded. Poirot lowered himself onto the bench with the careful economy of a man whose knee had not forgiven him for the garden, and sat for a moment in companionable silence. He had learned long ago that silence was often a more effective instrument than questions. People filled silence. They could not help it. Philip lasted perhaps 45 seconds. "I keep thinking," he said, staring at the billiard ball, "that I should have gone to see him. After supper. I thought about it. I was going to. Yeah, and then I didn't. And now I..." He stopped. "Why did you think about it?" Poirot asked. Quietly, carefully, the way one might approach something fragile. Philip was quiet for a moment. "Uncle Edmund and I had argued 2 days ago when we arrived. I said something I shouldn't have, and we hadn't properly cleared it up." He turned the ball over. "I don't suppose we will now." "What did you argue about?" The young man glanced at him sidelong. "Money," he said, with the slightly defeated air of someone admitting to something ordinary. "He was going to change his will. I'd heard, Roland told me, that Uncle Edmund intended to leave the bulk of the estate to some charitable foundation rather than the family. I was angry. I said things that were unkind. And Roland, was he also angry?" Philip set the billiard ball down on the bench beside him. "Roland," he said carefully, "was considerably angrier than I was. But Roland doesn't show it. Roland is very good at not showing things." He said it without particular inflection, but his eyes, when he said it, moved briefly toward the door, as though checking, out of long habit, that his brother was not within earshot. Poirot noted this. "This argument with your uncle," he said, "was it resolved at all in the days since?" "Not really. Uncle Edmund wasn't the type to rush reconciliations. He said he needed to think. He was going to telephone his solicitor on Friday morning." Philip paused. "He never got the chance." Cecily Ashworth was harder to find. Poirot located her eventually in the small sitting room off the main drawing room, a room within a room, which struck him as rather apt. She was at the writing desk, a letter half begun before her, though when Poirot entered, she placed her hand over it in a movement that was almost but not quite casual. She was a composed woman. That was the word for her, Poirot decided, composed in the musical sense as much as the common one. She had arranged herself very deliberately, and the arrangement held. "Monsieur Poirot," she said. Her voice was pleasant and measured. "Have you found something?" "I am still looking," he said, taking the chair across from her, without being invited, gently, apologetically, in a way that made the imposition feel like courtesy. "Mrs. Ashworth, you have been very quiet today. I'm not generally a talkative person." "No," he agreed, "but there is a difference between a quiet person and a watchful one." "You have been watchful." He paused. "You're watching your husband, I think." Something shifted in her face, just slightly, the way a curtain moves when a window is opened in another room. "I watch everyone," she said. "It is a habit. A useful one in certain circumstances." Poirot folded his hands in his lap. "Mrs. Ashworth, I will be direct with you because I think you are a woman who prefers directness, even when it is inconvenient. Did your husband leave your room at any point during the night?" The silence that followed was 6 seconds long. Poirot counted. "I sleep heavily," she said at last. "I take a mild draught for my nerves. I wouldn't necessarily know." "That is not quite an answer." "No," she said quietly. "It isn't." She looked down at the letter beneath her hand. Then she looked back at Poirot, and for the first time all day, the composure cracked, just at the edges, just slightly, like old paint on a warm afternoon. "I woke at some point in the night," she said. "I don't know the precise time. The bed beside me was empty. When I woke again in the morning, Roland was there. I assumed—" She stopped. "I told myself he had gone for water, or to use the bathroom. I told myself there was nothing significant in it. But you did not entirely believe yourself." Her chin lifted very slightly. "No," she said. "I did not." Poirot returned to Japp in the hallway, moving more slowly than he had that morning. His knee was genuinely troublesome now. Worse than the cold of the house had settled into it with a thoroughness he found unsympathetic. He stopped at the hall table and rested his hand on it for a moment, not dramatically, simply resting. And Japp looked at him with the awkward concern that large, practical men sometimes show towards smaller, older ones. "All right," Japp said gruffly. "Perfectly," Poirot said. Then after a moment, "My knee disagrees, but it is not consulted on investigations." Japp almost smiled. "Found anything useful?" "Several things." Poirot straightened and moved toward the drawing room, slowly. Roland Ashworth lied about remaining in his room all night. His wife, carefully with great reluctance, has confirmed it. He came downstairs. He was in that library, Japp, after the poison had done its work, and before the morning. He arranged the scene. The note, the broken case, yes. The murder itself required only the poison in the decanter. That could have been done at any time during the day, when the library was accessible and unattended. But the theatrical elements, the note, the smashed glass, the emerald taken, those were added afterward, by hand, in the dark. He paused at the drawing room door. "Which tells us something rather important." "What's that?" Poirot turned to look at him. "It tells us that the emerald is not gone, mon ami. It was not stolen by any curse, or any Maharaja, or any person from outside this house. It is here. Somewhere in Ashworth Hall, it is sitting very quietly, waiting to be found." He opened the drawing room door. "And tomorrow," he said, "we shall find it." The curse was never real. That night, Poirot did not sleep well. This was not in itself unusual. He had never been a particularly good sleeper. His mind had a habit of continuing its work long after the rest of him had declared the day finished, turning things over in the dark with the quiet persistence of a river working at a stone. But this night was worse than most. The bed in the guest room was adequate, but not quite symmetrical in its firmness, one side softer than the other, and the wind off the downs had found some gap in the old casement window and was making its presence known with a thin, irregular whistle that defeated all attempts at indifference. He lay on his back in the dark and thought about the library. He thought about the decanter, positioned on the drinks tray beside the desk. It is as natural and unremarkable as any object in a country house library, available to anyone who entered the room during the day. He thought about the timeline. Sir Edmund alive at 9:30, dead somewhere before midnight. The library door opened again at 10:15. That click, noted by Mrs. Peel, with 22 years of careful listening behind it. He thought about Roland Ashworth's hands. Clean, yes, but more than that, steady. The hands of a man who had decided something and had not since reconsidered it. And he thought about the note. The curse of the Maharaja does not forget and does not forgive. He had read a great many false documents in his career, forged letters, manufactured evidence, invented alibis written down and handed over with expressions of injured innocence. He had developed over the years a sensitivity to them that was almost physical, a faint discomfort, like a note played slightly flat, that settled in him when something was constructed rather than true. The note had given him that feeling from the first moment he read it. He sat up in bed at 2:30, which was undignified but necessary, and turned on the lamp on the bedside table. He'd brought the facsimile copy that Japp had permitted him, a photographed reproduction of the original, clear enough for his purposes. He read it again in the lamplight. The Ashworth blood has carried the stone long enough. The curse of the Maharaja does not forget and does not forgive. What was taken in greed shall be returned in death. The emerald goes back to the darkness. Do not look for it. Do not look for us. 3 things. He saw them now clearly, the way one sometimes sees a thing only when everything else has gone quiet. The first, do not look for us, plural. The curse as written implied a group, an organisation, a collective vengeance, and yet everything else about the note was singular in its construction. One voice, one grievance, one action. The US was an afterthought, added, Poirot suspected, because a plural felt more threatening, more ancient, more like the kind of thing a genuine curse might produce. But it sat awkwardly in the sentence. A real writer of threatening letters, a genuine fanatic, a truly aggrieved party, would not have mixed their pronouns. They would have been consistent, because their anger would have given the writing a natural coherence. This anger was performed, and performed anger is always, in some small detail, imprecise. And the second, what was taken in greed shall be returned in death. The construction was literary, deliberately so, archaic, almost biblical. It was the work of someone who had thought about how a curse ought to sound and had written accordingly, which meant they had composed it in advance in conditions of calm and had reached for a register they associated with mystery and antiquity. It was, in Poirot's private assessment, rather good. But it was the goodness of craft, not of genuine fury. The third thing was smaller, almost nothing. But Poirot had learned, in 40 years, to pay particular attention to almost nothing. The paper, heavy cream stock, as he had noted at the scene, the kind found in a writing desk, and the writing desk in Roland Ashworth's room, the one with the bare surface, the one that had been carefully tidied, had a small brass handle on its single drawer. Poirot had not opened that drawer. He turned off the lamp and lay back in the darkness and made a mental note to open it in the morning, and then lay awake for another hour while the wind continued its conversation with the window, and reflected that the business of finding the truth was occasionally indistinguishable from the business of waiting for it. Morning came grey and cold, with a mist lying low over the downs that softened the edges of the elm trees and made the house look, from the east garden, like something half remembered rather than fully real. Poirot came downstairs at 7, earlier than was his custom, and he felt it. He was stiff, his knee was no better, and he had not had his tisane, because the household of Ashworth Hall ran on a breakfast schedule of 8 o'clock, and Mrs. Peel, though excellent, was not a woman who made exceptions. He settled for a cup of tolerably decent tea and stood with it at the kitchen window, looking out at the mist and thought. Japp arrived at 7:30 from the village inn where he'd spent the night, looking considerably better rested than Poirot, and having the tact not to mention it. "The wardrobe," Poirot said, before Japp had fully removed his coat. "Opened it last night after you'd gone to bed," Japp said, hanging his coat on the stand. "Locksmith from the village. Very quiet about it." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced his notebook, flipping it open. Inside, 2 suits, a dress shirt, the usual, a pair of walking boots, and at the back, behind the boots, all wrapped in a hand towel, an empty glass medicine bottle. Brown glass, the kind a pharmacist uses. Label removed, but not carefully enough. There's adhesive residue and partial lettering. Lab will confirm, but I'd put money on it being digitalis. Poirot set down his teacup. "He kept it," he said. "Not with surprise or with something closer to recognition. He kept the bottle." "Foolish," Japp said. "Or hurried," Poirot said. "Or confident. A man who has constructed a supernatural explanation for a death does not, perhaps, feel the same urgency about disposing of the evidence as a man who expects to be immediately suspected." He paused. "He believed the curse would carry the investigation away from him. He believed we would be looking outward. He did not anticipate that we would look in his wardrobe quite so promptly." Japp almost smiled. "Key, that's what happens when you call in Hercule Poirot." "That," Poirot said, "is precisely what happens." He spent the mid-morning hours in the library. Not examining it, he had examined it. He sat in the leather chair beside the cold fireplace, the one that Sir Edmund Ashworth had presumably occupied on many evenings, and he thought. He did this with his eyes half closed and his fingertips pressed together beneath his chin, a posture that Japp had once described, to another officer, as Poirot going somewhere inside his own head and not answering the door, and he worked through it. The motive was clear enough. Roland Ashworth stood to inherit, or had believed he stood to inherit, the Ashworth estate, including the hall, the land, and the various investments accumulated over 2 generations of careful Ashworth money. Sir Edmund's intention to redirect the bulk of this to a charitable foundation would have represented, for Roland, not merely a financial blow but something more personal, a judgment, a statement made in the language of legal documents, that his uncle had looked at him and found him wanting as a recipient of the Ashworth name. For a man of Roland's particular temperament, proud, controlled, accustomed to regarding himself as the natural heir to things, this would have been intolerable. Philip had said it plainly enough. Roland was considerably angrier than I was, but Roland doesn't show it, and he had not shown it. He had smiled and waited, and somewhere in the previous weeks, perhaps after the solicitor's visit, perhaps after some final conversation with Sir Edmund that had closed the last door, he had made his decision. And he had obtained the digitalis, he had waited for the right moment, and he had used the family legend, the curse, the Maharaja, the old romantic darkness of the stone's history, as a coat to hang the murder on. It was, Poirot thought, a cold and rather intelligent plan. Not brilliant, there were errors as there always were, but cold. The coldness of it sat in him now, like the chill of the house itself, and he acknowledged it without pleasure. He opened his eyes. The empty space on the wall looked back at him, that rectangular ghost of faded wallpaper where the emerald had hung for 60 years. And Poirot looked at it and thought about what he had said to Japp the previous afternoon. The emerald is not gone, it is here, somewhere in Ashworth Hall, sitting very quietly. Where would a man hide a 40-carat emerald in a house he did not own? Not his room, too obvious, too searchable, and Roland had clearly already been thinking about searches when he locked the wardrobe. Not a common area where any member of the household might stumble upon it. Not outside in the garden or the outbuildings, too exposed, too dependent on weather and chance. Poirot stood up from the chair, slowly, with one hand briefly on the armrest, which he would not have done had anyone been watching, and looked around the library. A man comes into this room at 10:15 in the evening. The house is dark and quiet. He has perhaps 30 minutes, perhaps less, before the risk becomes too great. He must break the case, write the note, arrange the scene, and dispose of the emerald. 30 minutes is not long. Worse, he would not have left the room. Poirot turned very slowly, looking at the library with fresh eyes. Not the eyes of a man examining a crime scene, but the eyes of a man standing in a room at 10:15 at night, holding a large green stone, with 30 minutes and nowhere obvious to put it. The bookshelves ran floor to ceiling along 2 walls. Hundreds of volumes, leather-bound, uniformly spined, the kind of collection assembled over generations rather than read. Poirot moved to the nearest shelf and looked not at the books but at the shelf itself. Dust uniformly distributed, undisturbed. He moved along the wall. At the 3rd shelf from the fireplace, on the 2nd row from the bottom, he stopped. A faint absence of dust. In a gap of perhaps 3 inches, where a volume had been removed and replaced, recently enough that the dust had not yet resettled. The books on either side leaned very slightly inward, the way books do when a neighbour has been taken out, and put back not quite as it was before. Poirot reached in and drew out the volume. It was a bound copy of Burke's Peerage, 1889. Heavy, seldom consulted, perfectly situated for the purpose. He opened it. Folded inside the front cover, wrapped in a single sheet of cream writing paper, the same cream writing paper as the note, he observed, was the Emerald of Sussex. It was extraordinary. Even in the cold grey light of an October morning, in a Sussex library, it had a depth of colour that was almost architectural, green going down and down into itself, as though the stone contained its own weather. Poirot looked at it for a moment, with the simple, unguarded appreciation of a man who, whatever else he was, had always had an eye for beautiful things. Then he wrapped it back in its paper, replaced it carefully in the book, and put the book back on the shelf. He went to find Jap. "You found it," Jap said. "I found it," Poirot confirmed. "Leave it where it is for now. We will need it later." He picked up his hat from the hall table. "But first, mon ami, I need to sit down somewhere warm and think very carefully about what we do not yet know." Jap frowned. "What don't we know? We've got the bottle, the emerald, his wife placing him out of bed. We know what Roland did," Poirot said. "We do not yet know how he obtained the digitalis, or precisely when he administered it, whether it was placed in the decanter itself or in the glass, which matters for the question of premeditation versus opportunity. We do not know whether anyone else in this house was aware of what he intended." He paused. "And there is one more thing." "What?" Poirot was quiet for a moment, looking at the staircase. "Miss Lavinia Ashworth," he said. "She told me yesterday that she believed the curse was nonsense. She said it with conviction. But she also said something else. She said her brother found the story romantic, that he enjoyed it." He turned to Jap. "A man who enjoys a story about his family's cursed emerald does not typically keep that story entirely to himself. He tells it to guests, to family, to anyone who will listen." Jap's eyes narrowed slowly. "Meaning Roland knew the cursed story well enough to use it?" "Meaning," Poirot said, "that I would like to know who else knew it well enough to have suggested it. The little grey cells do not lie." The afternoon had turned darker by the time Poirot sat down with Jap in the small study off the entrance hall, a room that had apparently belonged to Sir Edmund's estate manager and smelled of pipe tobacco and old invoices. Someone had lit a fire, which Poirot appreciated without reservation. He pulled his chair closer to it and extended his hands toward the warmth, with an unself-consciousness that he would not ordinarily have permitted himself in company, but it was only Jap. "Right," Jap said, settling into the chair across from him and opening his notebook to a fresh page. "Talk me through it." Poirot was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fire. Then he said, "Tell me what you know about the history of the stone, not the legend, the actual provenance. Who has looked into it?" Jap flipped back a few pages. "We had a man at the yard check the family records this morning, at my request. Colonel Ashworth, Edmund's grandfather, acquired the stone in Jaipur in 1887. It was, according to the family's account, a private sale. But there are records, Indian Civil Service correspondence, a few letters that survived, suggesting it was rather more complicated than that. The stone had belonged to a minor royal house. There was a dispute. Colonel Ashworth was in a position of some administrative authority at the time, which apparently made the negotiation considerably easier. He looked up, which is a polite way of saying he used his position to obtain it at a price the seller was not in a situation to refuse. And the legend of the curse started shortly after. The family always maintained it came from the original owners, a dying Maharaja's parting words, that sort of thing. But there's no independent record of it. No contemporary account from anyone outside the family. Poirot nodded slowly. So the curse, in all likelihood, was invented, or at minimum greatly embellished, by the Ashworths themselves. Looks that way. Makes the stone more interesting, more valuable, in a social sense, a piece with a story behind it. And Sir Edmund told this story. Apparently, told it to anyone who'd sit still long enough. Japp made a small note. According to Mrs. Peel, he'd been telling it since she'd known him. Dinner parties, Christmas gatherings, whenever guests came. He had a set version, practically rehearsed. Poirot turned this over in his mind. So Roland heard this story many times, as since childhood from Philip's account. He knew every detail of it. The Maharaja, the curse, the particular language of supernatural vengeance. And used it, Japp said. And used it, Poirot agreed. But here is what I keep returning to, mon ami. He pressed his fingertips together. The note, it is one thing to know the legend. It is another to translate that knowledge into a written document that effectively mimics the voice of that legend. Roland Ashworth is a businessman. His correspondence, I've seen one letter on the desk in his room before it was cleared, is direct, functional, without ornament. The note in the library is none of those things. Japp looked at him steadily. You think someone helped him write it? I think, Poirot said carefully, that the note has two qualities that do not naturally coexist. It has the general architecture of Roland Ashworth's intelligence, practical, purposeful, designed to redirect rather than to genuinely deceive, but it has a vocabulary and a cadence that are not naturally his. He paused. It reads, in places like a passage from a novel. Japp was quiet for a moment. Then, Miss Lavinia. Poirot looked at him with something that was not quite approval, but was close to it. What makes you say that? She's the reader in the family. Mrs. Peel mentioned it this morning. Said Miss Lavinia has been at the Hall for 3 weeks. Spends most of her evenings in the library. And her room, Japp flipped a page. My sergeant had a look this morning while the family was at breakfast. Her bedside table had 4 books on it, or one of them was an anthology of Victorian ghost stories. Poirot sat very still for a moment. Victorian ghost stories. The language of the note, returned in death, goes back to the darkness. It was the language of that genre precisely. The elevated, slightly theatrical diction of a Victorian sensation writer. Not a businessman from London, not a man who wrote functional letters about quarterly accounts. A woman who had been reading ghost stories for 3 weeks, alone in a library that contained a legendary cursed emerald, and a brother who was not speaking to the nephew who stood to inherit everything. She knew, Poirot said, not as a question. Or suspected, Japp said. No, Poirot shook his head slowly. If she had merely suspected, she would have come to us. She is not a timid woman. She would have said something, obliquely, carefully, but she would have said it. He thought of Miss Lavinia's bright dark eyes, the handkerchief she'd never used. She knew, or she knew enough, and she made a choice. He found her in the library. This did not entirely surprise him. She was sitting in the leather chair by the fireplace, the same chair Poirot had occupied that morning, with a book open in her lap that she was not reading. She looked up when he entered, and there was no surprise in her face, only a kind of settled resignation, the expression of a woman who has been waiting for a particular conversation and has made her peace with its arrival. Poirot closed the door behind him and sat in the chair across from her. For a moment neither of them spoke. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the mist had not lifted, and the east garden was a soft grey blur beyond the window. You're going to ask me about the note, Miss Lavinia said. I am, Poirot said. She looked down at the book in her lap, closed it, set it aside. Her hands in her lap were steady. I didn't write it, she said. I want to be clear about that. But you saw it before it appeared in the library. A silence. 4 seconds. Yes, she said. Roland showed it to you. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, he came to my room. 2 nights before Edmund died, he said he wanted my opinion on something. He said he was thinking of writing to Edmund, a letter, setting out his grievances formally. He said he'd drafted something and wanted to know if it sounded right. She stopped. It wasn't a letter to Edmund. When I read it, I knew immediately what it was. What it was intended for. And what did you do? Her chin lifted fractionally. I told him it was well done, she said very quietly. I suggested 2 changes to the wording, and then I gave it back to him and went to bed. The words fell into the silence of the library and lay there. Poirot looked at her bright dark eyes which were steady and did not look away from his, and at her hands in her lap, which were still. And he felt, not for the first time in his long career, the particular discomfort of sitting across from a person who had done something terrible and was not, in any simple sense, a terrible person. Why, he asked. Not with accusation, simply with the genuine desire to understand. Miss Lavinia was quiet for a moment. Edmund was going to give everything away, she said. This house, the land, everything our grandfather built, everything our father maintained, everything Edmund himself accumulated over 40 years. To strangers, to a foundation, she paused. Roland is not a warm man. I am not blind to what he is, but he is family. This house is family. And Edmund was going to erase all of it, as though it meant nothing. Her voice, which had been steady, acquired a faint tremor at the edge. Not grief exactly. Something older and more complicated. I am 61 years old, Monsieur Poirot. I have lived in this family all my life. I have no children, no husband, no independent means. If the estate goes to a foundation, I have nothing. Poirot was silent. I knew what Roland was going to do, she said. I did not stop him. I helped him, in a small way, to do it less, clumsily. She pressed her lips together. Or I've not slept since. The handkerchief, Poirot said quietly. She looked at him. You carried it each day, he said, but you did not use it. Grief that is not permitted to express itself fully, it carries the instrument of expression, and cannot use it. Miss Lavinia looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked away, at the empty space on the wall where the emerald had been. Edmund was difficult, she said. He was proud and sometimes cruel, and he made decisions without considering their consequences for the people around him. But he was my brother. A pause. He was my brother. Poirot left her there and went into the hallway and stood for a moment with his hand on the newel post at the base of the staircase, not moving. He was thinking about what he had missed. He had not considered Lavinia's involvement until Japp had mentioned the ghost stories. He had been focused on Roland, Roland's hands, Roland's wardrobe, Roland's measured silences, and he had looked at Lavinia and seen a grieving sister and had not looked further. It was not perhaps a significant error. The central conclusion had not changed, and Lavinia's role, though morally complex, was peripheral to the act itself. But it was an error. He had been too quick to categorize her, and he had moved on. He did not make excuses for this to himself. He simply noted it, the way one notes a missed step, not with drama, but with the honest acknowledgement that the foot had not landed where it ought. He was tired. The house was cold, and the case was heavy, and he was 63 years old, and his knee hurt, and none of these things were reasons, but they were, perhaps, explanations. He straightened and went to find Japp. She helped him, Japp said. His voice was flat. She's an accessory. She suggested 2 changes to a document, Poirot said. Whether that constitutes legal complicity is a question for the courts, not for me. He paused. But there is something else. Japp looked at him. The digitalis, Poirot said. We know Roland obtained it. We do not yet know from where. It is not the sort of thing one buys at a pharmacy under one's own name without attracting attention. And Roland is not, I think, a man with medical connections. He sat down slowly in the hall chair, the small upright one beside the telephone table, and was quiet for a moment. "Miss Lavinia," he said, "Mrs. Peel told us she suffered from headaches. She takes a powder." Japp's eyes sharpened. "And there is another thing about Miss Lavinia," Poirot continued. "She mentioned, when I first spoke with her, that Edmund had a heart condition. She said it in passing, as though it were simply a known fact. At the time, I did not pursue it. I should have." "A heart condition," Japp said slowly, "which might be treated with digitalis." "In controlled doses," Poirot said. "In the correct quantity. A medicine. In a concentrated, incorrect quantity. A poison," Japp finished. They looked at each other. "She didn't just help with the note," Japp said. "I do not know that yet," Poirot said. "I do not know it, and I will not say it until I do." He stood up again, with the slight effortfulness he was no longer bothering to conceal. "But I think, Japp, that when we speak with Miss Lavinia again, that we must ask her one more question." "What question?" Poirot picked up his hat from the table. "Whether her brother Edmund," he said carefully, "was under medical treatment, and if so, who managed his prescriptions. The drawing room revelation." The drawing room of Ashworth Hall had not changed since that first morning. Still too many chairs, still too many ornaments, still that particular quality of arranged discomfort that country house drawing rooms achieve without apparent effort. But something in its atmosphere had shifted. The mist outside had deepened through the afternoon, and the lamps had been lit early, and the room had taken on a closed, yellowish warmth that was not quite comfort and not quite threat, but somewhere uneasily between the two. Poirot had asked them all to assemble at 4 o'clock. They came, as people always came when Poirot asked, which was something he had observed over many years without ever quite losing his quiet satisfaction in it. Roland arrived first, which surprised no one, and took the chair nearest the window with the deliberate ease of a man who has decided that his best remaining option is to project composure. Cecily came in behind him and sat as she had the first morning, close but not quite close enough. Philip arrived last, slightly flushed, and took the armchair at the far end of the room without looking at his brother. Miss Lavinia did not sit. She stood near the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantelpiece, her black shawl around her shoulders. She looked, Poirot thought, like a woman who had already arrived at her own verdict and was simply waiting for the proceedings to catch up with her. Japp stood near the door. He had the expression he wore when he was about to make an arrest and found no pleasure in the fact. The expression of a man who does his duty because it is his duty and has long since stopped expecting it to be satisfying. Poirot stood in the centre of the room. He did not begin immediately. He looked at each of them in turn, Roland, Cecily, Philip, Lavinia, with the mild, attentive gaze that had unnerved considerably more formidable people than these. Then he clasped his hands behind his back and began. "I will not," he said, "waste your time with a long recitation of what I have found. You are not, I think, people who benefit from theatre. I will simply tell you what happened, and I will tell you what we know, and then we will proceed from there." Roland said nothing. His hands were folded in his lap. His face was carefully, professionally blank. "Sir Edmund Ashworth," Poirot continued, "was poisoned on the night of Tuesday the 14th of October, between the hours of 10 o'clock and midnight. The poison was digitalis, a concentrated preparation, administered in his whiskey. He died in this library alone, without knowing what had been done to him. The poison was introduced into his glass. Not the decanter, as we first considered, but the glass itself, which was wiped after use and left on the desk as though it was simply an ordinary object in an ordinary room." He paused. "The glass," he said, "was wiped. But not the inside of the glass, only the outside, the part a hand would touch when placing it. The inside retained traces. This is a detail that matters because it tells us something about the state of mind of the person who did it. If they were thinking about fingerprints, they were not thinking about chemistry. A man thinking clearly about both would have removed the glass entirely. A man in a degree of not panic but heightened attention, wipes what he can see and leaves what he cannot. Roland's jaw had tightened by perhaps 2 millimeters. Poirot noted this. After the death, he continued, someone entered the library at approximately 10:15 in the evening. This person broke the display case containing the Emerald of Sussex, removed the stone, left a note upon the desk designed to suggest that the death and the theft were the work of parties connected to the stone's original owners. A supernatural vengeance, a Maharaja's ancient curse. He let this sit for a moment. It was, as an idea, not without a certain elegance. The Ashworth family legend provided the vocabulary. The theatrical elements, the broken case, the handwritten warning, provided the atmosphere. And the removal of the emerald gave the whole construction the appearance of external motivation. He turned slowly to face the window. The emerald, he said, is in the library. It has been there since Tuesday night, wrapped in a sheet of cream writing paper, the same paper as the note, and placed inside a volume of Burke's Peerage on the third shelf from the fireplace. It was not taken, it was hidden, because the purpose of its disappearance was never theft, the purpose was misdirection. In the armchair at the far end of the room, Philip made a small involuntary sound, not quite a word, not quite silence. Roland said, with the measured evenness of a man expending considerable effort, "This is a remarkable amount of conjecture, Monsieur Poirot." "It is," Poirot agreed pleasantly. "Let us therefore move to the things that are not conjecture." He turned to face Roland directly. "In your wardrobe, which was locked, and the key to which was not in your room, Inspector Japp's colleagues found an empty glass medicine bottle. Brown glass, label removed, but with sufficient adhesive residue to permit identification. The laboratory confirms it contained digitalis in a concentration consistent with the preparation used to poison Sir Edmund. The bottle is in the possession of Scotland Yard." The room was very quiet. "Your wife," Poirot continued, his voice unchanged, "has confirmed that she woke during the night of Tuesday the 14th and found your side of the bed empty. She does not know what time. She knows that when she woke again in the morning, you had returned." Cecily, across the room, did not look at her husband. She looked at her hands. "Mrs. Peel, the housekeeper," Poirot said, "heard the library door open at 10:15. She has worked in this house for 22 years and knows its sounds as well as its rooms." She heard it clearly. He stopped. He looked at Roland Ashworth for a long moment. "I have been in this work for a very long time," he said, and his voice was quieter now. Not gentle exactly, but without the precision of prosecution. Simply truthful. "I have sat in many rooms like this one, across from many people who have done what you have done, and then I have observed that they fall broadly into two kinds. The first kind is surprised by the evidence, by the speed of discovery, by the simple fact that the thing they believed they had hidden is no longer hidden. The second kind is not surprised. They have known from the beginning that the structure they built was not sufficient. They built it anyway, because the alternative was to do nothing, and they could not do nothing." He tilted his head very slightly. "You are not surprised, Mr. Ashworth." Roland Ashworth looked at him for a long moment. The composure held, but it held the way ice holds at the end of winter, which is to say, with a visible effort, and no great confidence in the outcome. "I would like," he said, "to speak with a solicitor." "That," Japp said from the door, stepping forward, "it is entirely your right." It was Philip who broke. Not dramatically. There was no scene, no outburst. He simply put his face in his hands when Japp moved toward Roland, and his shoulders came up around his ears, and he made the contained, effortful sound of a young man doing his utmost not to weep in a room full of people. Poirot went to him. He sat on the arm of the chair beside him, not in it, just on the arm, and said nothing. He simply sat there, which was sometimes the only useful thing. After a moment, Philip lowered his hands. His eyes were red. Was it because of the will?" "Yes," Poirot said. "If I hadn't told him," Philip stopped. "I told him about the solicitor, about Uncle Edmund's plans. If I'd kept quiet, then Roland would have found out another way. Poirot said. Or he would have found another reason. A man who has arrived at a certain decision does not arrive there because of one piece of information. He arrives there over a long time, by many roads. He paused. You did not do this, Mr. Philip. Do not take that onto yourself. Philip nodded once without conviction, but he sat up straighter. Miss Lavinia had not moved from the fireplace. When Japp had taken Roland from the room, quietly, with Cecily following in a silence that said more than any words she had produced all week, and Philip had gone upstairs, Poirot remained. He stood by the window, looking out at the dark garden, his hands clasped behind his back. Miss Lavinia spoke first. The digitalis, she said. You know. I know, Poirot said. He did not turn from the window. Edmund had a heart condition. He had been prescribed digitalis, a mild preparation. In very low dose. I managed his prescriptions when he was unwell. I have done so for years. A pause. I had a supply in my room, a small bottle, which is no longer in your room. No. Poirot turned from the window. He looked at her straight back, her steady hands, her bright dark eyes that were, he saw now, not quite as steady as they had been. Roland came to you, he said, not only for the note. He came to me for the note first, she said, 3 days before. He said he was writing to Edmund. I helped him with the wording. I did not let myself think too clearly about what I was doing. She stopped, restarted. And then he came back. The night before, he said he had a plan, and he needed one thing from me, and he asked for the bottle. And you gave it to him. The silence lasted a long time. Or, I told myself, she said, that I didn't know for certain what he intended, that I was only giving him a bottle of medicine, that it might mean nothing. Her voice was very controlled. I am 61 years old, Monsieur Poirot, and I have lived a long life, and I know when I'm lying to myself. I knew then. I gave it to him anyway. She looked at the empty space on the wall where the emerald had been. Edmund was difficult, she said. The same words she had said that morning, but quieter now, stripped of their previous composure. He was proud and sometimes cruel, and he was going to take everything away. But he was my brother. Her voice fractured on the last word, just slightly, just at the end. He was my brother, and I helped Roland kill him. And I have not slept since Tuesday night, and I do not expect to sleep again for a very long time. She reached into the pocket of her dress and placed something on the mantelpiece, a small empty brown glass bottle, its label carefully removed. I kept it, she said simply. I don't know why. Perhaps because I couldn't bear that there would be no record at all of what I'd done. Poirot looked at the bottle for a long moment. Then he looked at her. Miss Ashworth, he said, I must ask Inspector Japp to speak with you. I know, she said. I have been expecting it since yesterday morning. She reached for her shawl, adjusting it around her shoulders with the particular care of a woman performing a habitual gesture for perhaps the last time in familiar surroundings. And then she turned toward the door. Hin and Poirot stepped aside to let her pass. At the door she stopped without turning. The emerald, she said. Whatever happens to it, I hope it goes back. To India, to wherever it came from. A pause. It was never ours to keep, she went out. Poirot stood alone in the drawing room for a moment. The fire had burned low. The lamps gave their yellowish light. Outside the window, the mist had settled fully over the downs, and there was nothing to see but grey, a soft, total grey, the kind that makes the world feel very small and very quiet. He was tired. He was genuinely, deeply tired, in the way that had less to do with the cold or the knee or the bad night's sleep than with the particular weight of a case that had ended not with the clean satisfaction of justice, but with the slower, heavier settling of truth. Justice and truth were not all with the same shape. He had known this for 40 years. He still found it, on certain evenings, in certain rooms, difficult. He picked up his hat from the side table. He smoothed the brim once with his thumb. The same gesture, the same hand, as always. Japp appeared in the doorway. He looked at Poirot. He looked at the low fire and the empty chairs and the space on the wall. Right then, he said quietly. Right then, Poirot agreed. They went out together into the cold hallway, and the drawing room was left to its lamps and its silence, and the long, particular darkness of a house that had come to the end of something it could not come back from.